On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help. But because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away full time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate, and as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door, and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed, with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows, arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do, because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in Sealing. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, "Don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it." But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, "Is mom home?" And Tad said, "No, she's still not here." Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, "We got to call the police." 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy, could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, So on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend repeatedly to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed, as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him, and Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. He expected her to come home. This couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer, Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, "Where were you on Friday night?" which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday, and now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, "Yep, Jim failed his test," which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. I mean, because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with, huge adoration. I mean, they really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left: to sign a consent to search form, which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, "Sure." The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Under Sheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire, and it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news. Because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, He wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, I have more information about Janet, and it might be important. And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Revirago, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Françoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Françoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Françoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Françoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Françoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Françoise, like, what do you mean? Like, what's the issue? But Françoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Françoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club? But Françoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Françoise, like, hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Like, is that really the reason you're leaving? And Françoise just said, yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go. But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Françoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned this is happening so quickly. And then Françoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Françoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Françoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Françoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends, and Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Françoise could reasonably get together, but Françoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over, or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Françoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work? And she promised she would actually be home when he got there so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Françoise saw Yves' shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, you know what? I'd really, really like that. And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Yves finished getting dressed, he asked Françoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Yves was ready to leave, Francoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Francoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen, and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. There were two blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but he couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside, he saw very clearly there were two severed arms and the lower part of two legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these two bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only 1 day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this, because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled, compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Like, those two things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron, who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Françoise, the caller hung up. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Françoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Françoise Gendron, and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days, and he was starting to get worried about Françoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Françoise really did live in that apartment, and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door, and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Françoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, no drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. And then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Françoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot. And two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends, and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. She could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, and then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim. But for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to Francois Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son, who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also, he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Yves was there, to tell Yves that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francois Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking. And apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, he asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc. and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michelle and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michelle and Luc. And he sat down across from her, and he basically said, "Look, we know you're connected to the two men, Michelle and Luc, and also to Francoise, and we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know." And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michelle and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michelle was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michelle was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michelle if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michelle said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michelle, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michelle saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michelle, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michelle, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michelle for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, "Well, the body belonged to Francoise Gendron." When Michelle heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, "Michelle, did you kill Francoise?" And Michelle, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Francoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michelle's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Francoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Francoise's apartment. Francoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in, and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Francoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Francoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Francoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walked their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Francoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Francoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Francoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Francoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Francoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Francoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Francoise's head under the water, and again, Francoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. After Francoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub and then cut Francoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Francoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Francoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home. They would flush Francoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Francoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Francoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Francoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Francoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Francoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Francoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Francoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. One night in the fall of 1966, a 30-year-old man named Sam and his 3 friends snuck along the banks of the Eel River estuary near Eureka, California. And when they found a good spot to fish from, they put down all their fishing gear and opened up their tackle boxes. All 4 of them pulled out these special glow-in-the-dark lures, and they tried to stay as quiet as possible as they attached these lures to their fishing rods and then slowly waded out into the water. So Sam and his friends had to be really quiet and very careful as they did this, because what they were about to do was actually illegal. Now, they were going there to fish for salmon, which that in and of itself was not illegal, but doing it at night here was. And that was because the salmon at night would all gather together in this deep, slow-moving spot in the river to sleep. And so they were like extremely easy prey. You could practically just walk out and hit them over the head, and there you go, you got a salmon. And so on the one hand, it was sort of unethical. It's not really fishing anymore. It's just like smashing a fish in a barrel, basically. But more than that, it was very easy to overfish the salmon in this river if there wasn't rules protecting them at night. Additionally, those glow-in-the-dark lures that Sam and his buddies were using were also illegal because the salmon were really attracted to the lures, which again just contributed to even more overfishing. And also, keep in mind, a glow-in-the-dark lure could only really be used at night. And so again, it's sort of like you can't fish at night and you definitely can't use these lures. That's like a big no-no. But while Sam and his buddies were definitely aware of these rules in place that protected the fish, the reality was they didn't really care. I mean, they were here about to go fishing, so obviously they didn't care. And the reason for that is they made a lot of money by catching a lot of these fish at night and then selling them illegally. And so for weeks now, they had been sneaking into this part of the estuary every night to fish. And in fact, just to ensure they were successful, they had even begun bringing out lookouts with them, who were hiding along the road that led to the estuary to tell Sam if any fish and wildlife officers were out on patrol, in which case they would obviously stop and flee. And so now, Sam and his friends cast their lures into the river, and within a few seconds, Sam had a bite. I mean, unsurprisingly, the salmon are literally right there sleeping, ripe for the picking. And it took all his strength to reel in this catch because the salmon in this estuary were huge. Some could weigh up to 100 pounds. But eventually, Sam was able to wrestle the fish back up onto the riverbank, and then as soon as he had this monster up on shore, he cast his line again. About an hour later, Sam and his friends had caught so many fish that Sam wasn't even sure how they would carry all of them back to the truck. So he decided it was probably about time to call it a night. So, just for good measure, he cast his lure one more time into the water, and like always, he got a bite right away. But this time, when he began reeling it in, there was way more drag on his lure than he had ever felt before, even with some of the biggest fish he had ever caught. I mean, this was like a monster. And so Sam, he could barely turn his reel, like he could barely get this thing to move in the water. Then he's thinking, I have caught, for sure, the biggest salmon I've ever caught in my life. Like, this is incredible. And so he calls out to his buddies to get a net ready, come over here, get ready to catch this thing, it's huge. And his buddies are all excited, they got their nets ready, and he's reeling, and they can hear the sound of the water splashing. They can barely see, it's dark, but they know the fish is fighting like mad, and he's pulling, and finally, he gives one more heave, and he gets this fish up and out of the water, and all his buddies, they're all looking to see what he caught, and when they see what it was, Sam, after freezing, in terror for a second, he turns to his friends and just screams, "Run!" It would turn out Sam had not caught a gigantic salmon. In fact, he hadn't even caught a fish at all. What he really caught was a game warden with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Warden Terry Grosh, he knew that poachers were illegally fishing salmon at night along the estuary. And these poachers had lookouts hiding all over the place. And so none of the wardens had been able to catch these poachers before they were able to escape. So Warden Terry Grosh decided that he would need to take a more creative approach if he was going to catch these poachers. And so what he did on the night of Sam's big catch is he put on a full body wetsuit and slid into the water with the salmon before the poachers arrived. So he's hanging out in the water in the darkness, nobody can see him with the sleeping salmon, and what he was doing is waiting for the perfect moment to jump out and catch the poachers. But what ended up happening is the poachers actually caught Terry. But after Sam had reeled the warden out of the water, even though he yelled for his buddies to run, Terry Grosh just pulled down his hood and he's like, yeah, you're all under arrest. Once word got around that Terry had literally been in the water with the salmon to protect them, very quickly, poaching stopped at the Eel River estuary, at least for quite a while. And in fact, the stunt by Terry was so successful that it inspired a few other game wardens along the west coast of the United States to also get in the water and catch illegal fishermen that way. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Life can feel like a lot sometimes. Even when you're surrounded by people that you trust, you can still feel alone. Some thoughts just feel too heavy or too complicated to share out loud, so you hold on to them. I've definitely had moments like that where, everything just kind of stacks up all at once, and instead of talking about it, I just push through and keep it to myself. And the longer I do that, the more it just sits there and really weighs on me. But therapy gives you a way to finally unpack those thoughts and an opportunity to understand them, instead of just letting them sit. No matter where you are not alone. With BetterHelp, there's always someone with you, ready to listen and support you, no matter where you are or what you're going through. BetterHelp makes therapy accessible wherever you are, whether online or through the app. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Because no one should have to go through anything alone. BetterHelp is here with you. On a swelteringly hot day in 2009, a woman named Fatima walked down a dirt road toward a windowless shack on the outskirts of Mogadishu's Somalia. She was holding the hand of her 17-year-old son, Abdi, and as they got closer to the shack, she kept squeezing his hand tighter and tighter because Fatima was afraid. And what she really wanted to do was just turn around and run back home. But she knew she had to keep going because what was waiting for them inside of that shack was really her only chance to save her son's life. So Fatima and her son, they continue walking down the road, and they eventually reach the shack, and they go around to the front of it, and there's this metal door that was blocking the entrance. And Fatima, took a deep breath to steady herself, and then she knocked. And a few seconds later, a man opened the door. The man quickly greeted Fatima, but then with a very grim expression, he looked at Abdi, her son, and he pointed at him. And he said, "Are you ready?" But Abdi didn't answer. In fact, Abdi didn't even appear to be paying any attention to this man, or really paying attention to anything. He was just sort of lost in his own thoughts, looking all around. So Abdi had been a pretty typical child, but over the past few years, he'd begun acting really, really strange. It began with nightmares and panic attacks that sort of came out of nowhere. And then he also started freaking out like every time there was a loud or sudden noise. And then most recently, he'd begun getting into these strange mental states where he was so agitated and also confused and disoriented that he would sort of lash out at anybody near him, or even sometimes he would try to hurt himself. When Abdi would act like this, sometimes he would get so violent that his mother, Fatima, had to literally tie him up for his own safety. But remember, Abdi, he's 17 years old. He's almost a man, at least physically. And it was becoming harder and harder for Fatima to literally restrain him. And she was just getting really scared, not just for her own safety, but for her son's safety, for everyone's safety. Now, Fatima had taken her son to every hospital in Mogadishu, but the infrastructure in Somalia had been devastated by 2 decades of civil war. And so these hospitals are really nothing like the hospitals you would see in the West. Like, these are underfunded, the training is not great for the medical staff. Like, this is not a great place to go if you have a serious medical emergency. And so they were not able to help her with her son. And for Fatima, in her life, she had seen other people with symptoms that sort of mirrored what she was seeing with her son. And she knew from having seen these people that if they didn't get cured, unfortunately, the outcomes were very, very bad. Most of these people she had seen had wound up being chained to their beds, in locked rooms 24/7, or in some cases, these folks were chained to trees and left to die by their family who couldn't take care of them anymore. And Fatima, she didn't want that to happen to her son, and so she was willing to do virtually anything to save him. And so with that in mind, Fatima had been saving up money for literally years to try this final treatment, which was inside of this shack that she and her son had just arrived outside of. This treatment was extremely expensive, but she believed it was her only hope. And so this man in the hut, he sort of steps aside and gestures for the mother and son to come inside. And Fatima, who is very nervous, she leads Abdi, who's sort of, lost in space, inside of the hut. And then once inside, the man began sort of examining Abdi. And so while he was doing that, Fatima just sort of stepped aside and just sort of glanced around the interior of the shack. And she was sort of struck by how bare it was. There was literally nothing else in the shack other than this single plastic chair right in the middle of the dirt floor. That was it. But, Fatima knew this is all part of the process. And so after a few minutes, the man finished examining Abdi, and he turned to Fatima and he said, your boy's in good physical condition, so now they're ready to begin. But the man said to Fatima that, he would not be the one to actually perform the treatment on Abdi. The treatment that was going to be done on Abdi had to be done by a very specific kind of healer. This healer would have to stay in this shack with Abdi overnight, maybe even for multiple nights, until they managed to remove this thing that was causing all of his problems. And so Fatima, she just nodded, and she pulled out an envelope full of cash, and she handed it to the man, and then she turned to her son, and she gave him a big hug and told him she would come back when the treatment was over. Then Fatima, as quick as she could, she just turned and left, and the man went to go and get the healer. 2 days later, Fatima walked back down that same dirt road toward the metal shack. And this time, she was hopeful. I mean, she was expecting to see her son standing outside, waiting for her, grinning like he used to before, he got sick and everything changed. But instead, as she approached the shack, all she saw was that same man who was sitting in a chair outside of the shack. And when he looked up and saw Fatima, he just looked down and shook his head. Fatima immediately ran forward and began screaming like, "Where's my son? What happened?" And the man tried to restrain her as she reached the door of the shack, but she pushed past him and she opened up the door, and there, on the floor of the shack, was Abdi. And his body had clearly been slashed and torn all apart. But then before Fatima could even process this just horrific scene in front of her, she heard this high-pitched laughter coming from somewhere behind her. And she turned around, and standing inside the shack in the shadows was the healer who had done this to her son. It would turn out, after Fatima had tried desperately to get real medical help for her son, but it had not been successful, after that, she was so desperate, she turned to a very dangerous kind of folk treatment. There's an old belief in some parts of Somalia that mental illness is actually caused by possession, by an evil spirit known as a jinn. This belief says that there's only one kind of healer that can see the jinn and force it out of the person. But that healer with this special ability to do that was not a person. The healer was a wild hyena. And the treatment consists of putting the afflicted individual in a closed, small room with said hyena for hours or even days on end. Now, there are no real statistics on just how often this treatment is done in Somalia, but it's happened enough that there's been numerous stories of patients who have been subjected to it getting injured or being killed, just like Abdi. And since 2013, there's even been a big campaign led by a Somali nurse to try to end this sort of barbaric practice, and also to expand access to mental health care across Somalia. One morning in September of 1977, a 24-year-old doctor named Valaji Carvalho hurried into the examination room at our hospital in a remote fishing village in northern Brazil. The town was called Colares, and it was so small that Dr. Carvalho was actually the only doctor at the hospital, which had made her really good at treating all kinds of emergency medical issues because she had to treat basically everything. But despite all that, when Dr. Carvalho walked into the exam room and saw her new patient, who was this middle-aged woman lying out on this exam table on her back, when she saw what was clearly afflicting this woman, she had never seen it before. Like, this was something new. It was very curious. The woman had this very large burn on her chest, and the woman clearly was very panicked about this big burn, and she was begging Dr. Carvalho to help her. So Dr. Carvalho, she walked right over to the woman, who again is like really upset, and she tells her to calm down. She's gonna look her over. She's gonna figure out what's going on here. And so she throws on some rubber gloves, and very gently she begins to examine the burn. And immediately, Dr. Carvalho notices that this burn was like really strange. It was a perfect circle. Like, the burn was really, really uniform, and it was about the size of a soccer ball, so it's quite big. And it just kind of looked like a really bad sunburn. However, there were these two pretty clear puncture wounds, very small puncture wounds in the center of the burn that almost looked like a bite, like a spider bite that then caused this like massive burn or something. But it was just odd. And so Dr. Carvalho really actually didn't know what she was looking at. And so she just asked the woman, "How'd you get this burn?" And the woman, who again is very upset, she's very frantic, she's clearly uncomfortable, she began to sort of stumble through this pretty outrageous story. She said she'd been in her backyard and she'd seen something flash overhead. And when she looked up, she said she had seen this large flying cylinder that looked like it could have been made of metal. And then this cylinder apparently hit her with this beam of light that she described as feeling like it almost latched onto her, like the light had latched onto her chest. And then she had the sensation of something puncturing her chest and then feeling like blood was being pulled out of her. And then just as quickly as it had started, the light disappeared, whatever had punctured her chest was gone, and the cylinder and the light, all of it just vanished. And she was left with this horrible mark on her chest. Now, Dr. Cavallo was very polite, and as the woman spoke, she nodded along appropriately and, seemed to be really invested in hearing the details of the story. But when the woman was done talking, Dr. Cavallo's thinking, that didn't happen. That's absolute nonsense. At this point, she assumed this woman must be having some kind of mental episode. But she didn't tell the woman this. Instead, she told the woman that she would just need to transfer her to a bigger hospital located about 3 hours away in the next big city. Realistically, because Dr. Cavallo knew that the bigger hospital would have the facilities and resources to care for this woman properly, not just her burn and puncture wounds, but also whatever was happening to her mentally. So, Dr. Cavallo, she turned, left the room, and went to go make arrangements for this woman's transportation. And not long after that, the woman was on her way to the other hospital. And after that, Dr. Cavallo didn't really think about her again. However, the next day, when Dr. Cavallo was back at her hospital, she did find out that that woman who had gone to the other hospital, she had unfortunately succumbed to her injuries and had died. A few days later, Dr. Carvalho was back in her exam room, staring in shock at a new patient. It was a man, and he had the exact same burn pattern on his chest with the 2 puncture wounds in the middle as that woman from a few days ago, who had died 24 hours later. However, Dr. Carvalho is looking at this man's burn, and she thought, this one actually appears to be less severe than that woman's. So maybe this guy has a chance. It was the same location. It really did look the same, but it appeared to be a bit lighter, like it was not as severe. And also the man himself seemed very calm, like he was not hysterical the way the woman had been. He was just like, yeah, I have this burn. And so not only does Dr. Carvalho feel hopeful that she'll be able to actually treat his injury right here in her hospital, but also she's like, he's so composed, the patient, he'll be able to tell me what really caused this mark on his chest. And probably whatever happened to him is what happened to this other woman. And it certainly was not some cylinder in the sky. There's got to be a real explanation here. So Dr. Carvalho put on her gloves and began applying some burn ointment to this man's chest. And as she did, she asked him, hey, what happened? How did you get this? And much to Dr. Carvalho's surprise, this man, just as calm as could be, told basically the exact same story as the woman. He talked about this big metallic flying cylinder that had latched itself onto his chest through a beam of light and sucked his blood. I mean, it was the same story. Now, Dr. Carvalho was used to patients periodically lying about how they got hurt, but usually their lies were to make the story sort of more reasonable, not less so. So for Dr. Carvalho, I mean, what she's thinking is, I don't know what to believe, but clearly something really weird was going on here. But she had no idea what. And over the next few weeks, it only got stranger because more and more patients came into the hospital with these big circular burns. It got to the point where Dr. Carvalho, basically every single day, was treating a new patient who apparently had been attacked by some blood-sucking UFO. By November of that year, the entire region was completely freaked out. People were arming themselves with guns and fireworks and anything else they could use for protection against what everyone assumed was aliens from outer space coming to attack them. And while Dr. Carvalho understood why that was sort of the public's reaction, I mean, after all, there are people getting hurt, people dying from whatever this is, there's not a good explanation, so she got it, she understood the fear. But even though she's on the ground seeing this every day, she's still thinking there's gotta be a reasonable explanation for this. It's not blood-sucking aliens. There's gotta be something that explains this. Then, one night in late November, Dr. Carvalho left the hospital and began heading home for the night, and as she was walking, she decided she would take the long way home. That way she could walk along the beach and clear her head. About 20 minutes later, she was strolling along the sand and looking out over the ocean, and even though it was dark, there were still people out enjoying the evening breeze, and the whole thing felt very peaceful and nice. Until suddenly, Dr. Carvalho heard an ear-piercing scream, and she saw this woman sprinting across the beach, waving her arms and pointing behind her, screaming that a UFO had arrived. And Dr. Carvalho, she turned her head to look where she was pointing, and she gasped, because right down the beach, hovering maybe 100 feet over the water, is like this tractor-sized metallic cylinder, just hovering right there. I mean, it was clearly a UFO. It was the same thing that all these patients had been describing. There it was. Dr. Carvalho was not only shocked, but she was terrified. And everybody else on the beach, as they began to see this thing, they just started panicking. It was like complete pandemonium. People are screaming and running for cover, trying to get away as fast as possible. But Dr. Carvalho, despite instinctively wanting to run away with everybody else, she had this thought that, like, this is my moment. This is the time for me to go get a better look at this thing and figure out what in the world is going on. Figure out what this thing is that's clearly responsible for all these attacks. And so Dr. Carvalho began running towards the UFO. Everybody else is streaming past her, going the other way. She's running towards it until she was basically standing right underneath it. And she stared up at this flying cylinder, 100 feet above her, and she felt this overwhelming sense of awe, because this was unlike anything she had ever seen in her life. She knew that whatever this was, it definitely did not originate on Earth. And so Dr. Carvalho, for a few more moments, is just standing there staring at this thing until suddenly the UFO just flew off and disappeared. The Brazilian military would come to Colares to investigate these UFO sightings, and they discovered that all told, more than 400 people were burned by what they described as these mysterious beams of light coming from these flying cylinders. And several of these people died. As for Dr. Carvalho, she was never attacked by, a beam of light from this cylinder. But after her encounter with it, she would go on to tell newspapers that she fully believed that what she had seen was a real UFO, like not from Earth. The government investigation into these events came to be known as Operation Saucer. However, Operation Saucer never actually offered any explanation, really at all, for what the UFOs might have been. Today, the Brazilian government claims that they have fully declassified all the documents from Operation Saucer. But one military official who was involved in the operation claimed that some evidence was still kept secret from the public. On the afternoon of August 15, 2022, a 24-year-old beauty influencer and blogger named Sharaban K put on her makeup in front of a mirror in her bedroom in Munich, Germany. But this was actually Sharaban's childhood bedroom. She was in the home she grew up in. And looking around, it looked basically exactly the way it had when she was a teenager, when she last lived here. There were still pictures of her with her high school friends taped to the walls, and there were brightly colored pillows and furniture, like it was a time capsule of when she was in high school. But now, she's 24 years old. But the reason she was back here and living in this bedroom all over again is because just a few months ago, she had separated from her husband and had to move back in with her parents. And while her parents did accept her home, they were not exactly happy to have her here. So Sharaban's family belonged to a small ethnic religion called Yazidism. And one of the rules of this religion was that you absolutely cannot get divorced. And so this was a problem for Sharaban because things were not going well for her in her marriage, and she really wanted out. But both her parents and her husband's family refused to allow a divorce, and so she had just left. But in many ways, that had not solved the problem because basically everybody involved here, with the exception of Sharaban, was totally furious about the separation. Sharaban's own parents, they had agreed to take Sharaban back home, but it was on the condition that she would only be here until she and her husband fixed things, because they had to, because they couldn't get divorced. But Sharaban had no intention of ever going back with her husband. Really, no matter the pressure anybody applied, it was not going to happen. And this was primarily because Sharaban actually had a secret. And that was, a few weeks ago, she had met someone new, a young man named Shakir. And so when Sharaban was out at work, at least that's what she told her parents, in reality, she was actually just visiting with Shakir. And even though, Sharaban understood that her romance with Shakir was not only sort of forbidden, but also brand new, she still felt like there was something very real between them that was worth holding on to. In fact, their relationship was so good in their own eyes that the two of them had been working really hard on this plan that was going to get Sharaban out of her current predicament and away from her own family, and critically, away from her husband and his family. It was going to get her out of this marriage. Now, Sharaban's phone buzzed on her makeup table, so she put down her mascara, she picked up her phone, and saw she had a notification from her Instagram account. So she opened the phone up, opened up Instagram, and saw she had a direct message from the person she was currently getting all made up for, who she planned on meeting that night. And meeting this person was actually the first step in Sharaban and Shakir's plan. And so Sharaban felt her nerves buzzing as she read the DM with excitement, and then afterwards she finished putting on her makeup, she brushed her long black hair, and then she grabbed her purse, and then she headed out into the living room, and she told her parents who were out there that she was heading out. She was going to Ingolstadt, a city about an hour away, and that she'd be back in maybe a few hours. And so her parents are like, great, we'll see you then. And so Sharaban, she smiled, she walked out the door, she climbed into her Mercedes, and she drove off. But Sharaban, that night, didn't come back. A few hours after she left her house, her mom began texting her, asking where she was. But Sharaban didn't answer. So eventually her mom began calling her, but her phone just rang and went straight to voicemail, and she didn't call back. And by about 11 p.m. that night, when still Sharaban had not come home and nobody had seen or heard from her, Sharaban's mom was getting really worried. So the city where Sharaban had said she was going to, Ingolstadt, was actually where her husband lived. And so Sharaban's parents had actually been secretly kind of excited that maybe they were patching things up tonight and they might be getting back together soon. But for Sharaban to just disappear like this late at night and tell nobody was just so out of character that Sharaban's mom now couldn't help but think like, well, what if Sharaban and her husband did see each other, and what if they got into a big fight? Like, what if something bad happened? She didn't know. And so for her mom, she just couldn't stand to just wait around and hope her daughter turned up or hope her daughter got in touch. And so instead, she told her husband to grab the car keys because they were going to Ingolstadt to find their daughter. By about midnight, Sharaban's mother and father were in the car, Sharaban's dad was driving, and they were speeding through Ingolstadt. They were getting close to Sharaban's husband's flat, and their plan was to go knock on his door, didn't matter how late it was, and just see if Sharaban was in there or if the husband knew where she was, just anything to help them find their daughter. However, as they turned onto a quiet street that ran alongside a river, the mom suddenly yelled out to her husband, "Stop the car, stop!" And so the dad, he hits the brakes, he pulls over and stops, and the mom leaps out and she's pointing at something, and it's their daughter's car. It was parked right off the road, the Mercedes, right near the bank of this river. And so as the mom is running up to the car, she's telling herself that like, here's the explanation. My daughter must have just had car troubles. That's why she's delayed. That's why she hasn't been in touch. Like, here it is, like no big deal. She's gonna be in here. Everything's gonna be fine. But she runs up to the driver's side of that car and she looks in, and at first, she doesn't see anything. There's nobody in the front two seats of the car. It looks like no one's in there. But then she looks into the back seat of the car and she sees Sharaban, and she clearly is dead. Just minutes later, this street was absolutely crawling with police officers and emergency vehicles. And not long after that, Sharaban's parents, who were standing not far from their daughter's car, had to watch as police officers pried open the locked back door of their daughter's car, and then they reached in and they pulled out Sharaban's lifeless body. And she was covered in blood, and her body was also showing signs of rigor mortis. So it was sort of stiff, and to the parents, it was just horrible. The discovery of Sharaban's body immediately launched a full-scale police investigation. The city of Ingolstadt was relatively small, with a population of just about 80,000 people, and most years, there actually were no murders there at all. So this was like a really big deal. When the homicide detectives showed up on the scene, right away, just from looking at the body, they could tell that whoever killed Sharaban had done so in sort of like a wild frenzy, because Sharaban had been stabbed more than 50 times in the torso and the face. And so to detectives, this kind of overkill suggested that whoever killed Sharaban had to have had some really personal reason to go after her. And it didn't take the lead detectives very long to learn from Sharaban's very distraught parents that Sharaban's marriage was in trouble. And her estranged husband actually lived nearby, and they believed, the parents, that perhaps Sharaban had come here to Ingolstadt to visit with him. And so he lives nearby, they're in the process of potentially getting divorced, and so the detectives are thinking, seems an awful lot like the husband could be involved here. Within a couple of hours, Sharaban's body had been shipped off to the medical examiner for an official autopsy, and at the same time, the lead detective on the case had gone to Sharaban's estranged husband's home and hauled him down to the police station to be interviewed. Now, the detective had figured this would be a pretty, open and shut case. He fully expected the husband to have visible injuries on him and to be acting very wired and nervous because he's the one who must have killed Sharaban. However, when the detective actually met the husband turned out to be a very weak suspect. He had cooperated immediately and fully with investigators, and even offered to let them search his home and take his DNA. And he had an alibi for most of the evening before he'd gone to bed. And even though technically he didn't have anyone who could vouch for him while he had been sleeping, at least according to him, the detective doubted that just based on time, he would have been able to get up, leave his place, go kill her, dispose of the body, clean up, and then get back home again. It didn't seem possible. As for Sharaban's own family, beyond the husband, they really had no other idea about who might have wanted to hurt her. To their knowledge, Sharaban didn't have any other romantic partners other than her estranged husband, and she didn't socialize much outside of work. They said that really the only place where she met new people was on social media, because she was a beauty influencer and she posted photos and videos and gave advice on fashion. So 8 hours after Sharaban's body was discovered, so this is the morning of August 16th, the lead detective put out a release to the media asking for help from the public to identify suspects. And then he started digging into Sharaban's social media accounts. Just 24 hours later, on the morning of August 17th, 2022, so now just a day and a half after Sharaban was found dead inside of her car, her murder was solved. But the people involved in this murder truly shocked everyone. So Sharaban, she meets this new guy, Shakir, and she's madly in love with him, and the two of them, they just want to run off and be together, but Sharaban's, she's married, and she can't get out of that marriage very easily. And so the two of them, Sharaban and Shakir, they're trying to think of, how can we get Sharaban out of this marriage? How can we free her? And at first, it was like dead end after dead end. There was no way out. But then they thought of something, and it was very clever. But it was something that they needed help doing. It was not just in their power to pull this plan off. They needed a third person. Specifically, they needed to find another influencer, another beauty influencer. And so on the night of August 15th, so this is the night that ultimately Sharaban is found dead inside of her car, she found an influencer that was going to be perfect for this plan. Her name was Khadija, and she was also a beauty influencer. And on the night of the 15th, that's the person that Sharaban was going out to meet. That was the person she was messaging with on Instagram. And so Sharaban and also Shakir, they go into Ingolstadt and they meet up with Khadija, but they didn't fully inform Khadija about what exactly this plan entailed. In fact, really all they told Khadija was that once we meet up with you, we're beauty influencers, we have some really cool beauty products that we'll just give you. And Khadija's like, great. And so Sharaban and Shakir, they drive up alongside the curb, and there's Khadija, and she sees them, and she's all excited. She gets inside the car, inside of Sharaban's Mercedes, and once she's inside, she doesn't receive beauty products. Instead, Sharaban and Shakir pull out knives, and they proceed to stab Khadija to death right there inside of the car. And then once she was dead, Sharaban and Shakir drove the Mercedes right outside of Sharaban's estranged husband's apartment complex. They left the car there with the body inside, and then Sharaban and Shakir fled. It was all part of the plan. Khadija didn't know the plan, but it was all part of Sharaban and Shakir's plan. However, there's one detail that I've left out to this point that is effectively the actual reason Sharaban and Shakir were so convinced their big plan was going to work. So Sharaban didn't just need some random beauty influencer for their plan to work out. No, their plan was that Sharaban would find another beauty influencer that looked a lot like her, hopefully, that they would kill, they'd plant their body, and then Sharaban would take their identity, and she and Shakir would run off under this new false identity and live their lives, free of the marriage that Sharaban was trapped inside of. That was their plan. So they start looking for an influencer, and they find Khadija. And she is like an exact replica of Sharaban. They look identical. So much so that after they murdered her and planted her body inside of Sharaban's car and left her there to be discovered, they had everybody fooled, including Sharaban's own parents. They saw the body and they're like, oh, that's my daughter. They believed fully it was their daughter. The plan worked, and the husband's implicated for killing Sharaban. Everything's working out. But the one person that was not fooled was ultimately the coroner. Because when he began doing the autopsy, the body looked exactly like Sharaban's, except their teeth were different. They had different dental records, and that is the thing that showed this is not Sharaban, this is somebody else. And so at the same time that the coroner made this discovery, also all these people in Ingolstadt were calling the police saying, I think I just saw Sharaban. I don't think she's dead at all. I think she's at this cafe, or I think she's walking down the road over here. She seems just fine. And initially, police sort of dismissed these tips as being just bad tips, but when they put it all together and they looked at Sharaban's social media and her messages back and forth with Khadija, and when they saw a picture of Khadija, they put it all together and they figured it out. And so after putting all these things together, they actually went and found Sharaban, who had been spotted on security footage. They arrested her, they arrested Shakir, and then after, speaking to them and putting all the evidence together, they figured out that this had been their plan all along. And so both Sharaban and Shakir were ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. One morning in August of 1987, a 57-year-old woman named Claudia Sessi walked down the aisle of a historic church in Lyon, France. In the back of the church, a musician was playing a very solemn hymn on a pipe organ, and right behind Claudia, 4 of her sons and nephews were carrying her husband's coffin. So Claudia's husband had died suddenly just a few days ago, and she still really couldn't believe he was gone. A part of her kept thinking that like any day now, she was gonna get a call from the morgue telling her there'd been a mistake and her husband had just been asleep this whole time. But as she took her seat in the front row and looked around at all the friends and the family that were gathered there wearing black and dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, she finally began to accept the truth. Eventually, the organ music dies out and the church goes totally quiet, and the priest makes his way up to the pulpit to begin the funeral mass. However, right as he began speaking, there was this sort of muffled sound that at first it was really hard to tell what it was, but it was loud enough that it stopped the priest from speaking. He stopped what he was doing and sort of looked around, and then people began to gasp in the church because the sound, this muffled sound, it was coming from inside the casket. And so Claudia, when she realized that, she shot up to her feet and she's staring at the casket, and everyone's like, what's going on? And then people began to scream because suddenly they realized what the sound was. It was a voice, and it was muffled because it was coming from inside the casket, and the voice, which was a man's voice, was saying, "Let me out of here." And so the priest, he's overlooking this scene of absolute chaos. He's seeing everybody screaming and running around. Nobody knows what to make of this. He's terrified. He's presided over hundreds of funerals before. He's never ever heard of somebody waking up in the middle of their funeral. And he's looking over at Claudia, the widow, and at first she seems so happy, like scared, terrified, but happy like her husband is back, and she begins to run towards the coffin. But she only makes it a few steps before she grabs at her chest and she collapses to the ground. And this seemed to snap the priest out of his shocked daze here. And he ran down to Claudia, and other people were running over to Claudia, and the priest began yelling for someone to call an ambulance. And then he rushed over to the coffin, expecting to find that Claudia's husband was somehow still alive, and he was going to open it up and free him. But when he opened up the coffin, the husband was obviously dead. There's no way he just yelled, "Let me out of here." Not possible. He was definitely dead. So at first, this was just like a terrifying scandal that was sort of localized. But after police investigated and figured out what actually happened inside of that church, This story blew up and ricocheted all around the world because truly, it is unbelievable what happened inside of the church on that day. It would turn out there was a man in attendance that day at the funeral who was both one of Claudia's husband's friends, so he was there, grieving the loss of his friend, and he was also a ventriloquist, somebody who's able to throw their voice. And he thought it would cheer everyone up if he threw his voice and made it sound like the dead man, his buddy, was crying, "Let me out of here," from inside the coffin. It was meant to lighten the mood. But the prank worked so well that people thought it was real, and Claudia literally thought it was her husband coming back to life, and she was so overwhelmed as she ran to her husband that she had a heart attack and died. Now, the friend, the ventriloquist, immediately took responsibility and felt horrible. He felt like he basically killed Claudia. But despite that, police never charged him with any crime because ventriloquism is not illegal. On the morning of March 18th, 1963, a 16-year-old girl named Eileen Welch was chatting with her friends outside of her high school in Yorkshire, England. It was a few minutes before first period, and there were dozens of other students milling around outside the school, waiting for the bell to ring. Eileen was holding an armful of books and telling her friends about what she had done over the weekend, when suddenly she began to scream. At that same exact moment, Eileen's friend, who had been standing with her just a moment ago, watched as Eileen just began to rise into the air. There was nothing around her lifting her up. She just began inexplicably raising into the air, like 30 feet into the air, and she's screaming. And like this friend, she's looking up at her, and all around her, all the other students, they're looking up at Eileen, just being suspended in air by some phantom force. And Eileen, she's screaming, and then suddenly she comes careening down and slams into the ground so hard, and everybody's just screaming like mad. And someone began running towards the school, yelling for someone to call an ambulance. Eileen was rushed to the hospital, clearly in agonizing pain with, multiple broken bones, severe internal injuries. And the first responders and the doctors at the hospital and the medical staff, they did everything they could to save her. But just 2 hours after she smashed into the ground from, falling from 30 feet in the air somehow, she died. When police went back to the school to begin their investigation into what happened, detectives literally could not believe the dozens of eyewitness accounts. The detectives questioned 37 students and teachers who were all outside that day that watched what happened to Eileen. And all of them told the same story. That Eileen, out of nowhere, just suddenly rose into the air like 30 feet, and she held up there for a second, and then came smashing down. Now, at first, the police just didn't believe the stories they were being told. They're thinking there's got to be more to this story. People don't just raise into the air and smash back down again. That doesn't happen. But when all these accounts were the same, and they all had the same amount of conviction behind them that these people, they saw this, the police realized, this is apparently what happened. And so they began to assume that the only way this could have happened is that this was some product of a bizarre weather phenomenon or something, like a mini tornado, lifted her into the air or something. So they actually brought in several meteorologists into this investigation. But the meteorologists concluded that what everyone claimed to have witnessed was basically scientifically impossible. Because in order for the wind to pick someone up the way they described Eileen being picked up, the winds would need to be blowing at least 110 miles per hour. And there were no winds of anywhere near that speed reported anywhere in England that morning. And even if there had been a sudden gust of wind that was able to lift Eileen up, the reason that still couldn't have happened the way it was described is Eileen was near other people, in close proximity. There's no way that she would be the only one affected. Other people would have been blown into the sky, but nobody was. It was just Eileen. To this day, none of the 37 witnesses have changed their stories, and there has never been a scientific explanation for what happened to Eileen. And so the cause of her death, to this day, remains a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Around 7 p.m. on Saturday, August 13th, 2011, 19-year-old Wang Weijie was with his friends Ma Jun and Zhou Guo at an internet cafe in the city of Taiping, China, watching Jun play a computer game. Now, Weijie and his friends went to this cafe a lot, and today they had literally been there for hours by this point. But now, as Jun finished up the game he was playing, Guo announced that he was actually ready to go do something else now. So the three of these guys spent a lot of time together, whether it was at an internet cafe or elsewhere. They were like really close friends. And generally speaking, Weijie usually just did whatever Jun and Guo wanted to do, since they both had strong opinions, and Weijie was more of a go-with-the-flow type of guy. And so now, as Guo decided they were done with games, Weijie was just like, all right, cool. Well, why don't we just head back to one of our places just to hang out? But Guo, he shook his head and said, no way, like it's Saturday. They didn't have to be up for school the next day, and so they could stay out all night if they wanted to. And so he said, like, we gotta find something really exciting to do. Like, we gotta make the most of this night. Now, nobody had like a great idea of what was gonna be super exciting. And so Guo was like, all right, well, for now, like, let's just go outside and we can smoke first, and then we can go from there. And at this, both Jun and Weijie just nodded in agreement, like, okay, that's the plan. But in reality, Weijie wasn't really sure if he felt comfortable staying out all night tonight, because tonight was not just a normal night. Like, this was an iffy night to stay out all night. So this particular weekend was not just an ordinary weekend. It was actually the area's annual Ghost Festival, a time on the lunar calendar when ghosts apparently would wander the streets after dark. And Weijie's family, along with his friends' families, and frankly, a lot of other people in this area, they took this festival really seriously. They believed the ghosts really were out wandering the streets after dark because they were just very superstitious. In fact, in this area, this festival was taken so seriously that businesses would often close early so people could safely make their way home before nightfall. Now, Weijie himself didn't really necessarily believe in ghosts, despite his family appearing to very much believe in them. But the reality is Weijie was just not a guy who ruffled feathers. He went with the flow. He was a rule follower. So in his mind, he was thinking, it's the Ghost Festival. Kind of don't want to stay out late tonight. But now, Guo was already making his way towards the exit with Jun, and so Weijie didn't bother to argue. Instead, he just followed right along and they went outside to smoke. About an hour later, Weijie was sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with Jun behind the wheel and Guo in the back, and they were driving down a road in the outskirts of town. And by this point, the sun had set, and so now they were officially in Ghost Festival territory. Like, presumably there are ghosts out now out on the roads. So after leaving the internet cafe, the three of them, they had a smoke, but then as they're out there, they couldn't come up with a compelling idea for how to spend the rest of their big night out. All they came up with is, let's just get in the car and drive around and maybe we'll figure out something to do. Now, initially, when they hopped in the car, they're thinking, okay, it's getting dark out, we're gonna be driving around during the Ghost Festival, we're bound to find something exciting to do. And so all of them are they're amped up, they're in the car, they're pumped, we're gonna find something fun. But after a while, they were just randomly driving around. No one's really out because, again, it's this Ghost Festival. Everybody's, in their homes. There's nothing going on. And it just became really, really boring. They're just driving around and nothing's going on. And so at a certain point, Weijie is just feeling so frustrated because it's he didn't want to be out here in the first place. He didn't voice that to his friends, but he didn't want to be out here. He just wanted to be home. And so he just was man, this is so boring. And he just leaned his head up against the window and just decided to drift off to sleep. And so he's closing his eyes and he's just laying there, and Jun, who's driving, is just, driving along. They're not really talking. And so Weijie, as he's laying there, he suddenly feels the car come to a screeching stop. And Guo in the back seat immediately, reflexively screams at Jun, the driver, hey, what are you doing? Drive more carefully. And Weijie, he's looking around what just happened? And he looks over at Jun, who's driving, and Jun is not paying any attention to Guo or to Weijie. He's just pointing out the windshield at something on the road, and he's like, look. And so Weija, who's just sort of confused because a moment ago he was half asleep, he looks from June out the front windshield to see what he's pointing at, and there's this woman who's just sitting in the middle of the road. They're out on the outskirts of town. Like, there's no really any buildings around or anything. Like, they're out in the sticks, and it's dark out, and everyone's home for the Ghost Festival, and there's just this woman sitting on the ground. She's wearing this floral dress, and there's a bike that she has that's next to her, just propped up. And she's almost been hit by a car. Like, they stopped very close to her. She's almost been hit by a car, and she's just sitting there staring blankly at the car. And so June, he's pointing at her like he can't believe it. He almost hit her, and Wei just like, what's going on? And Guo, like, he doesn't even know what to make of it. And at some point, June sort of snaps out of it, and he leans out the window and he yells at the woman to, like, get out of the way. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out of the road. But the woman didn't budge. She just sat there staring at them, just on the ground, not a care in the world, just looking right at all three of them. And so eventually, after sort of the tension in the car went down a little bit, June just pulled his head back in the window and he looked at his friends and he's like, I don't know. And he just drove around this woman, just avoided her, and they continued driving along. For the next few hours, the three boys just continued driving around town, looking for something to do, but there still was nothing to do. Everything's basically abandoned because it's this Ghost Festival night. Nobody's out, no businesses are open, there's nothing to do. And what really had not left any of their minds, even though they really didn't talk about it, was that woman. Like, that was so unusual to just see her sitting there, not reacting to nearly being hit. Like, the whole thing was just so creepy, made more so because it's the night of this Ghost Festival. Like, talk about the creepiest night to see something like that. And so eventually, around like 1 a.m., when the boys are still just driving around, someone in the car suggests, like, hey, let's go back to that intersection and see if she's still there. Like, let's just see what she's doing. Now, keep in mind, it's been hours since they've seen this woman, like hours. And so they drive back around, not really expecting to see her there. They think that, like, no matter how weird that was, she has to have gotten up and left by now. But no, they turn onto that road, which again is outside of the town. It's like there's no buildings around. It's dark, minus their headlights. And they drive down this road, and sure enough, off in the distance, still sitting in this intersection, is this woman. She's unmoved. She's just sitting there in her dress with a bike next to her, just hours later, no change. And so now it's like the boys can't help but feel really uneasy here. Like, this isn't right. Something's wrong with this woman. I mean, also they can't help but think, like, it's the night of the Ghost Festival. Are we seeing a ghost? Like, they're terrified. I mean, that's the reality, is they were scared. But really, more than anything, what all three of them are thinking and discussing in the car is, we gotta tell someone about her. Like, there's something wrong with this woman. What is she doing? Is she mentally unwell? Is she on drugs? We don't know, but like, this isn't okay. We gotta tell someone. But for now, the three boys decided that they had had enough fun for one night, and they drove to June's house, and they just all crashed there, determined to figure out what to do with this woman and what they saw the next day. And so several hours later, the boys wake up, they make their way into the kitchen because they can hear June's mom is in there making breakfast. And right away, June tells his mom what happened the night before. And as he's regaling her in the details of the story, June and Guo also chimed in with their perspective. And then after they were done telling June's mom, they all sort of expected her, being an authority figure, to know what to do. That she would very likely say, okay, we need to call the police, or we need to call a hospital, or we need to call some other authority figure and handle this professionally. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she just kind of looked at the boys and she said, you saw a ghost. You can predict the Summer Soccer Showcase action all the way to the final match with FanDuel Predicts. All you have to do is sign up to get your $25 bonus. I downloaded FanDuel Predicts during one of the matches just to try it, and let me tell you something. Every play suddenly mattered way more, and every pass had a little more weight to it. It's all right there on your phone, super easy, and it kind of pulls you into the action in a way that just watching doesn't. Sign up now for your $25 bonus on FanDuel Predicts. Go to fanduel.com/predicts to sign up. That's fanduel.com/predicts to get your $25 bonus. Offered by FanDuel Prediction Markets, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant, 18+. Bonus is non-withdrawable and expires 7 days after receipt. Trading derivatives involves significant risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Manage your activity with their consumer protection tools. Restrictions apply. See terms at fanduel.com/predicts/bonus-offer-terms. Now, at first, all three boys were just shocked at how confidently and calmly she said this. I mean, of course they knew about the annual Ghost Festival, and of course, people in this town were very superstitious, including their own families. They knew this meant a lot, this festival. But the idea that we're gonna sit here and literally say that the woman we saw sitting on the ground last night was a literal ghost, that seemed crazy. And the boys began saying as much to June's mom. But June's mom was just really annoyed with them and just basically shot them down and said, look, you saw a ghost, but that's the reason you're not supposed to be out on the night of the annual Ghost Festival. It's why the business is shut down. It's why we all go home before nightfall. You knew you weren't supposed to be out at night. You were. That's why this happened. Not to mention, these ghosts, they don't just wander around. They target people. You were targeted. Now, June's mother was not just throwing that out there. She was referencing one other aspect of this annual Ghost Festival that lots of people in this area believed, which was these ghosts that wandered around after dark on this one night of the year, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for people to effectively latch onto. And so part of the reason people believed you need to stay in at night and avoid being out after dark is because if you basically interact with one of these ghosts, they could latch onto you and then you become its target. In some cases, people believe it just produces really bad luck for you for potentially months at a stretch. Some other people say that once you've been targeted by one of these ghosts, they may try to kill you. Specifically, they may try to drown you. And so no one really knew, but it was like this belief that you just never want to interact with a ghost because it could be very bad for you. And so June and Guo, they still tried to argue a little with June's mother, trying to tell her that no, this could not possibly be a ghost, but their voices seemed less forceful now, and Weijia, he was sitting there thinking actually, if that was a ghost, this kind of makes sense. It explains why she didn't react at all to nearly being hit by a car. She just sat there. Also, why is she just sitting there? Strange activity for anybody to be doing. Maybe a ghost would do that. It also kind of explains why she was still there hours and hours later, just sitting in the middle of the road. Other cars must have gone by. This is not normal behavior. And so Wei just thinking, wait a minute, maybe this was a ghost. However, just as Weijia really started to feel almost sick with worry about, the seriousness of what had happened, he heard June's mom tell them, don't be afraid. She said, look, I know exactly what you need to do to stay safe. Later that same day, Weijia parked his car at a cemetery that was near June's house. And after he parked, he and June got out while Guo stayed behind in the car. All three of them were very tense. They were very anxious. And as Weijia scanned the headstones and looked over at a cornfield that was next to the cemetery, all he was thinking is this ghost woman is going to appear at any moment and she's going to do something to us. But she didn't. And so eventually, Weijia and June began walking down the path that would lead them through all the gravestones, basically deeper into the cemetery. So the reason these two were here and now walking into the cemetery is because they were following June's mother's advice for how to stay safe now that they had potentially come in contact with this ghost. And so they had gone out and acquired a stack of ghost money, and now they were going to go spend it. So ghost money is a kind of paper sheet in China that typically is burned when a loved one dies. The idea is when you burn this money, it sort of goes to the deceased loved one, and then they have money for the afterlife. You're basically giving your deceased loved one currency for the afterlife. But it can also be a way to buy protection from angry spirits. So Weijia and his friends have been told to burn ghost money over their family grave plots so that their dead ancestors could essentially pay the ghost, the evil ghost, to leave them alone. Now, they'd already done this at Guo's family plot in a separate cemetery, so that's why Guo was staying back in the car, and now they were going to do June's family plot in this cemetery. And so Weijia and June, they continue walking through the cemetery until finally they reach some of June's ancestors' graves. There, they knelt down, they pulled out their ghost money, and they began to burn the bills. And they're both just kneeling there, burning this money. And with each, bill that crumpled up and smoldered, both of them were feeling like this enormous wave of relief coming over them. And so for a little while, they're just burning their money, and they're both looking down at the money on the ground. They're just kneeling there. But then at some point, Ouija just looked up. And as soon as he did, he froze. Because standing right behind June can't see this, right behind June is that woman in a dress. And she's looking at both of them. And Ouija was so scared, he shrieked, he jumped up, turned, and started running in the opposite direction. Now, June is so startled by Ouija screaming that he jumped up, ready to run away himself, but he's watching Ouija take off, and he turns around because he could tell Ouija saw something behind him, but there's nothing behind him. And he's thinking he must have seen the ghost, because why else would he react this way? But there's nobody here. And so June sort of put together, like, what's going on here? Like, Ouija clearly spooked himself. We're in a cemetery after all. And he sees Ouija, and he's running, and he disappears into the cornfield that was next to the cemetery. He's just gone, just running, he's gone. Now, this cornfield was pretty massive. It had not been harvested, so the stalks were really tall. And clearly, like, Ouija was on a mission. And so June was not about to just chase after him. Instead, he ran back to the car and he grabbed Guo first, and the two of them went after Ouija. However, when they got to the cornfield and actually went inside of it, they quickly realized it was going to be really hard to find anything in this cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so thick and tall, it's so dense. I mean, every step was so slow and difficult, and they're calling out for Ouija, but there's no response. And so after several minutes of only moving, like 10, 15 feet or so into this cornfield, making no progress, the two of them are like, what happened to him? Like, either the ghost got him, or like maybe he's in hiding somewhere. Maybe he's convinced that the ghost is nearby and he's just being quiet and he's in hiding and he's somewhere in this cornfield, but we gotta find him. And so the two friends, they back out of the cornfield and they end up calling a bunch of their friends to meet them at this cornfield and help them look for Ouija. So all these friends, they eventually arrive, and all day and into the night, these friends search this cornfield. They're looking everywhere for Ouija. Everyone's screaming his name, but there's no sign of him. 3 days later, and Ouija still had not been found. Now, by this point, the parents, Ouija's parents, had been told. They had told police. Police had looked for Ouija, but there was no sign of him. I mean, they were still out looking for him, but right now, like, the talk of the town was, where is Ouija? Nobody knew. And so on this day, 3 days after the day that Ouija went missing, June was sitting in his room just feeling miserable. All he can think about is his friend and what happened to him. Like, he ran off after presumably seeing this ghost. Like, did the ghost get him? Like, all these horrible thoughts are going through his head. And June, as he's sitting in his room, he hears his mom call out to him, telling him there's a visitor. And so June, he gets up, he leaves his room, he goes to the front of the house, and he sees a police officer standing in the doorway. And this officer would tell June and his mother that they had found Ouija, and he was dead. His body was found in a lake that was not far from the cemetery, and that he had drowned. June is completely shocked. I mean, on the one hand, he sort of was expecting bad news at this point. I mean, basically everybody was. But to hear that his friend was dead was just horrific. And he, really struggled to keep back tears. But, before he could really even react to this, the officer went on to say that, June, we spoke to Ouija's parents and they told us that you and Guo were with their son last, that you were with him before he vanished. And so we just want you to tell us, now that we know he passed away, that he drowned, we want to know what happened. What did you see? Like, what led to him drowning? And June, he just launched into the most detailed version of the story he could possibly think of. He took the officer all the way back to them at the internet cafe, playing computer games. They decide they're going to stay out all night. They go outside, they're having a smoke, they're talking about what they're going to do. They decide they're going to get in the car and just drive around. They're driving around on the night of this ghost festival. They see this woman, they think it's a ghost. Like, he went through this whole rendition of the ghost being really central to this story, and how the next day June's mom had said, oh, go burn ghost money in the cemetery to protect yourself from the spirits. They go to the cemetery and they're burning the ghost money, but then Ouija, he gets so scared June's convinced it's because he sees the ghost again, this woman, and he takes off running into the cornfield. So he tells the officer like every little detail. And he knew that even in a place like this, where people did, for the most part, believe in ghosts, he knew his story like really hinged on a ghost made Ouija do this. And he knew that it was like totally preposterous in some ways, but he thinks he's telling him the truth. And so he tells the officer all this stuff. And the officer's just staring at him, and he's clearly very skeptical. And then at some point, after June is done, and he's just waiting for the officer looks at him and he asks him one question that once he answers honestly, it completely explains everything that happened. It would turn out that woman who was sitting in the middle of the road that sort of became the centerpiece of this whole ordeal was not a ghost. In fact, she wasn't even real. Because the three friends, June, Guo, and Ouija, on the night they decide to have their big night, they're going to stay out all night. When they went out for a smoke, they didn't smoke cigarettes. They smoked methamphetamine, which can cause you to hallucinate. And so they were high on meth driving around and hallucinated that woman. But they all, believed they saw it, and it felt so real, and it was on the same night as this annual ghost festival that it felt so real that even the next day, when they were no longer high, they still believed they had seen it. And then June's mom confirmed, yep, that was a ghost, because she believes in ghosts. And so they set out to the cemetery, and they're gonna, burn this ghost money to save themselves from these evil spirits. And what do they do before they head out to the cemetery? They smoke more meth. And Ouija, he has another hallucination. He thinks he sees the ghost, ran into the cornfield, not realizing that deep in the cornfield was a lake. He fell into it, and he was high on meth and didn't know how to swim, and so he drowned. On the night of August 28, 2004, a 21-year-old named John Hutcherson leaned over a bar in Marietta, Georgia, and asked the bartender for another beer. John, by this point, had completely lost track of how many drinks he had had in the past few hours, but he was sure it had been a lot, because by this point, the room was starting to spin. However, he had no plans to stop drinking anytime soon. After all, it was only midnight, which was very early for John, and he was having a great time, and the bar was packed, and there was loud music playing, and John was also on a winning streak, playing pool. And so while he waited for his beer, John looked over at the pool table. He had left his best friend Frankie there a few minutes ago, but now, as he was looking over there, he didn't see Frankie anymore. So John and Frankie had been very close ever since high school, and this night out they were having was sort of like a typical Saturday for them. Every week they would meet at this bar, they would get exceptionally drunk, and they would basically stay out all night. But on this night, they were both a lot drunker than usual, and now Frankie was gone. And so as John very drunkenly looked around the bar to see if he could find Frankie, he noticed a girl he didn't recognize at the end of the bar. She was very cute, and she appeared to be smiling at him. And so, John sees her and forgets all about his friend Frankie being gone and just smiles back at this girl. And then a moment later, the bartender hands him his beer, and John's feeling really confident. He takes his beer and he begins walking towards this girl. However, before he actually reached her, he felt a hand on his arm, and he turned to see Frankie, who looked just awful. He looked so pale, he smelled like vomit. And Frankie told John, as well as he could, because he's so drunk, he's mumbling everything. He just said he felt horrible and it was time to go. Now, John was really disappointed because even though he was really, really drunk too, he wasn't as bad as Frankie. Like, John had not reached the nauseous and vomiting phase of extreme intoxication. And so he's thinking, man, there are a couple more hours till closing and I really want to talk to this girl. But he was Frankie's ride, and Frankie had to go home, clearly. And so if he was going home, John had to go home too. So John just chugged his beer, put it back on the bar, and then he turned and kind of waved at the girl, being like, sorry, I gotta go. And then John pulled his car keys out of his pocket. And so John and Frankie, they head outside to the parking lot, and John goes to his truck and he climbs into the driver's seat. And as he's fumbling with the keys to start the car, Frankie had gone around to the other side and stumbled his way into the passenger seat. And even though he's like wrecked drunk, he's like totally out of it, Frankie looks over at John and sees him unable to even start the car. And he's like, hey, are you sure you're good to drive? And John looks over at Frankie and he's like, of course, I'm just fine. I do this every single week. We always get home safe. And so at this point, Frankie's like, all right, whatever, let's just go. And so John, he eventually manages to turn the car on. He throws it in gear and he began to pull out of the parking lot onto the road. But as he did, he really had to squint his eyes just to see the road clearly. His whole world is totally spinning because of how intoxicated he was. And then as soon as he actually began driving down the main road on the way home, the first thing he did is he's like hitting the curb and swerving back onto the road, but he was, basically steady. He's totally wasted, but he's basically hanging on. And then the rest of the drive was just a blur. John was white knuckling it the rest of the way. He's driving along, he sees the gas station that he always passed on the way home, so that's a familiar landmark. He's going the right way. He eventually passes a familiar billboard, but then at some point his eyes like snap back into focus because he realizes he's swerving off the road onto the shoulder, but he swerves back just in time to avoid hitting a telephone pole. And he's like, oh man, I got this, stay focused. And then somehow, some way, eventually he winds up in front of Frankie's house. And so he drops his friend off and then back on the road he goes, navigating now at this point, with one eye shut. And he eventually finds his way to his parents' house where he was staying. And from there, he climbed out of his car, he walked up the driveway, he unlocked the front door, and then stumbled up to his room where he immediately just fell into his bed and passed out. The next thing John knew, he heard voices, and then he felt somebody grab his arm and shake him. And then when he opened his eyes, his vision was very blurry, but eventually it came into focus and he saw that he was clearly in his bedroom, in his bed, on top of his blankets, but he had no idea how he got there. He looked down and noticed he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they were sticky and they were dirty. And then there were also these two figures who were standing over him, repeating his name over and over again, almost angrily. John looked at these two and didn't really know who they were, but then he noticed they were both wearing matching uniforms. They were police officers. And these officers were very angrily asking John, what happened last night? What did you do? What happened the night before? But John, he still is sort of trying to figure out what's even going on. He really doesn't have a good memory of anything that happened the night before. All he can just quickly remember is he was at that bar, he saw that girl, he drove Frankie home, he knew he was drunk on the ride home, but he got home. He didn't know what else they were trying to figure out about what happened the night before. And so when he finally opened his mouth to be like, what is going on? Because he was still basically drunk, it just came out of his mouth like this incoherent babbling. He was like, what's going on here? And the two officers, they were just over it. And they just grabbed John and literally pulled him out of the bed. They whipped his hands behind his back. They handcuffed him. And John, who's like, what is happening? They lead him out of his bedroom, downstairs, past his mom and dad who are staring at him like, what is going on? And even though John, again, is basically borderline incoherent, in passing by his parents, he's hoping they're gonna be like, hey, officers, why are you arresting my son? But instead, as he's led past them, he looks at his mom and dad, and they're not about to put up some fight. They're crying. They're holding each other and crying. They clearly know something bad has happened and they can't stop what's happening to their son. And so the officers, they walk John in handcuffs out the front door and they walk him over to his truck in the driveway. And when they got there, the officers just stopped and gestured for John to have a look inside. And so John, he's sort of looking at the officers like, okay, what's going on with my truck? And he turned and he just sort of squinted and looked through the window into the car. And there was this large object in the passenger seat that he didn't remember being there the night before. Then as he looked more closely, he realized with horror what it was. So the night before, John did drive when he absolutely should not have. He was clearly way past the legal limit for driving. He should never have been driving, totally unsafe for others, for him. Shouldn't have happened, but he did. He drove. And so he and Frankie, they're driving home, and John, in his limited memory, recalled, this sort of blurry ride home, where basically as dangerous as it was, he got them home. But at one point, he remembered almost hitting a telephone pole, and he swerved just in time and he narrowly avoided it. And in some ways that was true. He did avoid smashing into the telephone pole, but he didn't avoid an incident. So Frankie, because he was so nauseous from having drank too much, he had his head out the window as they were driving along trying to get some fresh air. And when John drove too close to that telephone pole and swerved at the last second, Frankie's head was still out the window and his head was decapitated by one of the tension wires coming off the pole. The tight wire that holds that pole into the ground, one of them, it's like a guillotine, and they're speeding past it, and Frankie's neck hit the wire, off went his head. But his body remained in the passenger seat of the car, and John was so belligerently drunk that he didn't see he had just killed his friend, nor did he see his friend's body, or a part of his body, still in his car. And so when John drunkenly arrived at Frankie's house, and he's like, all right, bye, he thought maybe Frankie got out of the car, but clearly he didn't. He was just there, dead, in his passenger seat. And then John just drove back to his parents' house and just left the car in the driveway with his friend's body inside, and up to his bedroom he went and passed out, having no idea what he had just done. A few months later, John would plead guilty to vehicular homicide, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison.